Hello guys, and welcome to part 2 of my Manchester build. I say part 2 of the build, but I didn't really do any building at all in the last video. Instead we took a look at the Airfix base kit, which is the Manchester Mark II. You could use the Mark I or the Mark III kit, but I just happened to have this one available. We looked at the Blackbird Models conversion kit, and for some reference and some guidance we looked at the Wing Leaders Production Avro Manchester book, which is a fantastic reference. And at the end of that video I came up with this table here, which very generally summarises the development of the Manchester according to my understanding. So with what we have in the Blackbird Models kit, we can't make the Prototype 1 or the Prototype 2 without various changes, but we can make either the Mark 1 or the 1A. Now since that last video I've just clarified one thing, and it's the difference here between what I've called the earlier and the later Mark 1s. So I've got the earlier Mark 1 down here with the 28-foot tailplane. Apparently only a very small number of those were made, less than 30, and the majority of Manchesters had the 33-foot tail span, as the Lancaster did. Related to that, because the ones with the 28-foot span were very early, none of them had a top turret. So those features now are mutually exclusive. I can either have a 28-foot shorter tail span or I can have a top turret. I quite like that top turret. It's got a very distinctive shape. It's quite ugly actually, but I think it really does make the aircraft stand out as a Manchester. So I think I want to do a later Mark 1. I'd already decided really that I don't want to do a Mark 1A because I don't want those taller tail fins, and I do want the third fin because again that's quite a distinguishing feature of a Manchester. Now even within that bracket of what I've called a later Mark 1, there are a few variations. So we can see here, for example, on page 31 of the Wing Leader book, we've got L7319. It's got the top turret, it's got the third fin, it's got the shorter vertical fins, and you'll notice it's got no shroud around the top turret. Whereas if we look a little bit later in the Wing Leader book, on page 43 here, we've got L7453. That has the same third fin, it has the same short vertical fins, and it has a slight fairing around that top turret. Much smaller than the Lancaster one, and the Blackbird Models conversion does give us that fairing, so both of those would be great examples of aircraft that I could build. One interesting feature of the first aircraft here, if you can see it on the camera, is it's got two shades of black there, the night and the special night. And essentially what's happened there is that's been converted from a low, straight demarcation line to a high, wavy demarcation line, and the colour of the paint has changed during that process, which is why you've got two shades of black there. On the other hand, on L7453, we've got a much more conventional, wavy camouflage demarcation. Anyway, on with the build, and I started by following the Blackbird instructions. That didn't last very long and I deviated quite soon afterwards. But the first step in those is to cut the kit wings down to size, and rather handily that happens on the second panel line from the wing root. To remove the outer wing I simply scored along that panel line with my craft knife, not trying to cut through in one go but just score a bit deeper each time. This Airfix plastic is very soft and it's quite easy to slip and end up just scoring the wing, which unfortunately I did do in one case, but hopefully that'll be an easy fix later. Until you're left with this stub of the wing. Of course you have to do that for upper and lower sides, and then that should attach to the Manchester wing like so. Of course I haven't cut the moulding block yet off the Manchester wing. When you do cut that resin block off, you do have to be careful because there's a section of the wing edge that looks like it's excess resin, but actually it's there deliberately, and it's there to encourage you to get the dihedral on the wing correct. As you can see here, I failed to get a dead straight edge because I took a bit too much resin away, so that will need some filling later on. With the two Airfix pieces together, you can see how they're going to meet up with the Manchester wing. And of course this is all just dry fitted at the moment, but I think you can tell there's a fairly decent match up there between those, and any issues like that gap there are entirely of my own doing. Now, as you can see from these kit pieces, they do have some wing spars that go in there and give them strength and also sort of push them out to get the right shape. So before we do anything else on the wing, we do need to build up the wing spars, and in order to build up the wing spars we need to build up the cockpit and the fuselage. I won't take you step by step on the building up of the fuselage because I've built Lancasters on this channel before, and I've got a few more to build, and the Manchester interior is very similar to the Lancaster. To be honest, I found this interior less detailed and harder to build up than I remember. I wonder if I'm remembering the Revell Lancaster kit, which just seemed to be a bit more detailed. Anyway, there are a few minor modifications, so we have to snip off this screen here, which I believe is supposed to be the H2S radar screen. Earlier versions of the Manchester also had different radios to the later Lancaster, but that's irrelevant for this kit because it doesn't include the radios. I could have sworn that I built these kits before and they did. But you can see we don't get a radio and we don't get a seat for the radio operator either. The one real difference that we have, and I'll deal with it later, is that we should have a dual control column for the pilot, and the seat for the flight engineer / second pilot is apparently slightly more robust than that of the flight engineer seat in the Lancaster. So here is our interior without any modifications for the Manchester, and those are the wing spars there that we need for the wings. For these kits I find it's always a lot easier to paint the inside of the fuselage and the floor of the cockpit separately and then glue them together. You can see here I've gone for a base coat of black followed by a interior green top coat. I believe that's the correct colour, but to be honest I'm not 100% sure. The windows on the Manchester are the same as those on the Lancaster, until they were later deleted of course. So with a small amount of super glue they were put in place, and as long as you use a small amount I find you don't really get any fogging. Then I used Vallejo model colours to paint the interior fittings. We do have a couple of decals at this stage for the engineer's panel and the pilot's instrument panel. I know these are going to be inaccurate for the Manchester because of course we don't have 4 sets of engine controls, we only have 2. But to be honest, I'm not really worried about that small level of detail in this build. I put the two fuselage halves together, and as with every Airfix Lancaster I've built, they were slightly warped and I had a problem getting the whole thing glued together at once. So this nose section had to be done later. Then I can move on to those wing spars, and you can see here I've just dry fitted the 4 sections that go between the 2 spars, and they should fit very neatly into that kit part, like so. The fit for the top and bottom pieces of the wing there is quite tight, so I only glued the top into place, and also we do have some work to do in there as well before we close it all up. Of course with this conversion I'm dry fitting everything at every stage, and you can see here as we try to dry fit the engines, the fit at the top is perfect. However, at the bottom we have these small flaps which are catching on the engine nacelles. So though the Blackbird instructions don't mention it, we can actually just remove this part of those struts. And once they're cut down, you can see that nacelle fits there extremely well indeed. This is a really good quality resin kit. Excellent fit all round. You'll also notice there's a small raised section here which is supposed to fit in a notch on the engines. The resin parts do have that notch, but I can never quite get it to line up perfectly. So rather than put too much pressure on the plastic parts, I simply sanded off that raised plastic area. You can see here how the Manchester wing will mate with the Airfix wing. And one consideration here is that the resin, of course, is very heavy, so I don't think that simple end-to-end joint is going to give enough surface area. I'll need some kind of strut in there to try and hold that joint together and strengthen it. Here I'm just messing around with a bit of old off-cut sprue, just to get an idea of what I could do. It's going to be slightly more difficult than it might look, because the thickness of the plastic is different to the thickness of the resin, which means if the outside wing surfaces are flush, the interior surfaces are not flush. And of course, if the interior surfaces are flush, that means the exterior surfaces are not flush, which is not what you want. To get around that difference in thickness, I used a small strip of styrene on the inside of the plastic part to build it up to the same thickness as the resin part. Then I didn't have a lot to work with because there's only a very narrow opening in the resin wing. Ideally, I suppose some kind of metal rod might have gone in here, but I don't have any to hand. So I simply went with a small wooden skewer. This is slightly thicker than a cocktail stick, and I was hoping that by supergluing this to both the plastic and the resin parts, it would provide enough strength. Unfortunately, again, due to the narrowness of the opening, we can't get another strut there at the leading edge of the wing because the landing gear needs to go into place. The only other option would be through the centre, which of course would be visible when the model was complete. Another small issue I noticed here which needs resolving is that the landing gear legs attach like this to the front of this sort of bulkhead here. However, if we try to put the Manchester engine over the top, we can see it doesn't fit, and even trying to rotate it, it doesn't fit very well. The problem is the top of the Airfix piece is just a bit too wide. As you can see, if I try and squeeze it in here, the legs are really pushed together. I was almost breaking the piece at this point. The solution for this was just to use my craft knife and to thin down the thick pieces of plastic at the top end of the landing gear legs. The lower end of the legs themselves will fit perfectly well, it's just the bulky top which is the issue. And I think that's a better solution than trying to take something out of the middle and then moving the two legs closer together. And of course, if we did that, we'd somehow have to make the narrower legs have a narrower tyre too. I did consider forgetting about that and just making the Manchester with the gear up. However, if we look at the gear bay doors, we'll see that they are a little bit small for the opening. And if we do that the other way around, the same thing, they fall quite easily through that gap. So really we need to cut those in half as the instructions recommends and have the gear down. Once I was happy with the dry fit of all those pieces, I could start to put them together. First of all, I painted everything in the landing gear bay black and then interior green over the top. Then I could clamp the lower piece of the wing into place. Before the engines go into place, we have to deal with the flaps. Now you'll notice here that when we put the kit flap piece in, we have a small gap on the outside edge here. And that's, I think, because the next flap along on the Lancaster kit would cover that, but the Manchester supplied one doesn't. It's just a couple of mil gap, but it doesn't look good. So what I decided to do was to take the spare outer flap piece from the Lancaster kit, which won't be used in this conversion, and as you can see here, that's bigger than the inner flap, and then I simply straightened the edges because it's not quite square, cut off the angle, cut off the notches to attach it, and basically made myself a small replacement piece. So here's the original piece with that gap on the outside edge, and here's the replacement piece I made. Not perfect there on the inside, but I can tidy that up. It's ragged on the outside edge, but I'll wait till it's glued into place and then I can sand it flush with the wing without going too far. And of course there's an extra panel line I need to engrave in there. It doesn't matter that the inside detail of this is slightly angled because the flaps are going to be raised and therefore the detail won't be seen. And with the flaps in place, I could finally attach the engines. As I said earlier, I removed that notch there and simply glued the engine in by eye. The fit was generally good, although the port engine had a small gap on the upper surface, which I'll need to fill later. But overall it came out looking quite nice, and it's starting to look now a little bit more like a Manchester. Of course there's lots of detail still to be added. We've got the intakes on the top and the bottom of the engine still to add separately, but I think if I just dry fit the wings here, you can get a bit of an impression of what it will look like. So that's where I'm going to leave today's video. This is the bulk of the large pieces done. Of course there's still a lot of clean up on the Lancaster itself to do. The seam lines are not perfect, but really then it's lots of small details that need doing, and that needs lots of research from me as well. So just making sure I've got things like the correct combinations of pitot tubes, aerials, etc. for the variants that I've got. I also need to make that dual control column, I haven't forgotten about that, and of course do the turrets. So there is still quite a lot of work to do, but it's all smaller details compared with the bulk of the build that I've done so far. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do about the wheels. Apparently the Lancaster wheels were smaller than the Lancasters, but I haven't got a lot of reference material to say exactly how big or small they should be. Anyway, that's all for a future video. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I've really enjoyed building this conversion. Helped of course by the really nice quality of those resin parts. Thank you to all of you for watching, and special thanks to my YouTube members and Patreon supporters. Your ongoing support is hugely appreciated, guys. So thank you again to everyone. I hope to see you in a future video, and until then, have fun modelling.